By 2040, half of Americans will live in a handful of Democratic states, but they'll only have a fraction of representation in the Senate. How do we fix this? Check it out, leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. You know that by 2024, half of America will live in, the entire population of the United States will live in 8 democratically controlled states. Those states will have 16 senators out of 100. And the rest of America is going to be Republican controlled, it seems. I mean, this could be really scary. So what do we do about this? I mean, this is a serious problem. So during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln and his Republican Party, which at the time controlled both the House and the Senate, they needed 2 more senators to make sure that they had control of the Senate. They saw this slipping away. And this is 1864. And at that time, it took 125,000 residents to create 1 congressional district. So some states had more than 125,000 residents. So like New York or Massachusetts, you know, they had a couple of congressional districts. They had a couple of people in the House of Representatives because they had not 125,000 people, but 250,000 or more than that. You know, but for every 125,000 people, you had 1 member of the House of Representatives in 1864. And by coincidence, that number, 125,000 people, was also the cutoff, the minimum number necessary to become a state. If a territory, which is how the non-states were referred to, if a territory wanted to become a state, they had to have 125,000 people. So we are in 1864, and Abraham Lincoln needs 2 more senators. In order to become a state, it's a very simple 3-step process. Number 1, there has to be a referendum by the citizens of the states in which they vote to become a state. So the state has to, the territory has to say we want to become a state. Number 2, somebody has to introduce legislation in the House and Senate to make that territory a state, and it passes by a simple majority. This is not a supermajority thing. And number 3, the president signs the legislation. It's that simple. But Nevada only had 7,000 people living there, at least 7,000, quote, legal residents, 7,000 people who, you know, in addition to the Native Americans there. 7,000 white people. But Lincoln needed a senator, so he said, let's do it. And sure enough, in 1864, Abraham Lincoln got 2 more senators by adding all 7,000 people in Nevada. But then 22 years later, in 1876, Ulysses S. Grant had the same problem. He needed 2 more Republican senators. And at that time, the Colorado Territory only had 40,000 people. It still required 125,000 people to be a state, but he said, screw that, and made Colorado a state in 1876. And then in 1889, when Benjamin Harrison had, after they'd kicked the Democrat Grover Cleveland out of the White House, Benjamin Harrison wanted a couple more senators, and so he took the Dakota Territory, and the entire Dakota Territory. There were 98,000 people living in what we now call South Dakota. There were 36,000 people living in what we now call North Dakota, which is a total, if my math is right, of 134,000 people, just enough to make 1 state. But Republican President Benjamin Harrison said, no, we're going to split this in half and call it North Dakota and South Dakota because I want 4 senators. And he did it. And for that reason, from 1861, when Lincoln was inaugurated, until 1933, when FDR, you know, on the heels of the Great Depression, won a landslide victory, in that entire period of time, Democrats only controlled the Senate for 8 years. Because, you know, the Republicans kept doing this. Well, it's time to turn the tables on this. D.C. has more people than Wyoming and Vermont and has already had the referendum saying we want to be a state. Puerto Rico has many more people than Vermont and Wyoming together. And they've already had a referendum, and 97% of their citizens said, yes, we want to be a state. And then you got, Stacey Plaskett, I think her name is, who was the real breakout star in the impeachment hearing. She represents the U.S. Virgin Islands in Congress, and like Eleanor Holmes Norton, who represents D.C., she can't vote. She can only speak. Well, the U.S. Virgin Islands has only 100,000 people, which is a little below the threshold for statehood. You could add it to Guam, I suppose, and call it Islandia. But let's just take the U.S. Virgin Islands. I mean, it was good enough for Abraham Lincoln. It was good enough for Ulysses S. Grant. It was good enough for Benjamin Harrison. 3 different presidents made states out of territories that had way too few people to be qualified for statehood. So let's add 3 states to the Union and get 6 new Democratic senators by adding Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. I think it could work. I think it could be a really big deal.